Do you think wealth is equally spread out in the UK?
Nowhere near at all. It's probably getting worse. The money is there, it's just being used in the wrong way.
The richer will get richer and the poorer will get poorer. But you can't blame the people who got money.
Well, I mean, salary isn't exactly wealth because you have the inherited wealth.
This is What If, a podcast from the Intergenerational Foundation. Here we talk about solutions to intergenerational unfairness. This is season 4, and today we're going to be thinking about wealth. How is wealth spread between generations? How does it shape our economy? And what if we had a wealth tax? My name is Mary Holditch and I'm your host. Wealth means different things to different people, but wealth, and whether you have access to it, can mean the difference between owning your own house or spending the majority of your income on rent. It can mean living off your savings or working long hours for a paycheck. Wealth distribution in the UK has become increasingly unequal. One idea to solve this problem is a wealth tax. It's an idea that the Intergenerational Foundation have spent a lot of time thinking about. They've just published a report on it. I spoke to the team at the Intergenerational Foundation to understand a little more.
Hello, I'm Liz. I'm a co-founder and the chief executive of the Intergenerational Foundation.
My name's Angus Hanton. I'm a co-founder of the Intergenerational Foundation.
My name is Alec Haglund. I'm a researcher at the Intergenerational Foundation, and I'm also the author of our wealth tax report.
So let's start with some context. What are the problems in our society that this wealth tax is trying to address?
Principally, what we're looking at is a tax situation where earned income is taxed very heavily. So young people, that's all they have really, their earnings, and those are taxed. It doesn't take long before they're paying 40% tax plus national insurance, so about a 50% tax rate. Whereas if you contrast that with income that older people are getting, that's very often in their pensions or in their ISAs, and they're getting their income, their unearned income, tax-free. No income tax, no national insurance. So it's an absurd contrast at a time when young people are struggling so much, and the older generation, baby boomers, are the wealthiest generation we've ever had.
What Angus is talking about is one of the two problems wealth tax aims to solve. That in the UK, the income you receive from work, i.e. your wage, is taxed at a higher rate than the income you receive from wealth, for example, interest on your savings or rent you receive as a landlord. Of course, this kind of discrepancy can't be described as fair, but it has another impact on how it affects old and young people differently.
Because the economy has changed since the time that the people who now are old and wealthy, since they were young, the economy today looks very different. For example, we have had low economic growth, but quite high returns to capital. And at the time when you have low real economic growth, but high returns to capital, that means that those who have wealth will be able to continue to grow that wealth, while those who do not have wealth, the young, are going to be unable to grow their wealth at a similar rate that previous generations had. And we can see that even in the past 10 years, we don't have to go back many decades to compare. Because, for example, even in the past decade, those who are above 65 years old have managed to grow their wealth on average 3 times faster than those who are aged between 25 and 44.
But there's another side to this too, and it's how that tax is spent.
The reason that we are taxed is so that the government can provide services. And those services are provided across generations. What we know from our previous research before this report is that government spending has declined for children and young people, but it's stayed the same for older generations. Now, that might not be a problem. The problem is, though, that those older generations are living longer. Therefore, the amount of money that the government is having to spend on that generation is increasing, while the tax base is not increasing.
In terms of government spending, the really big departments are National Health Service and pensions. So pensions are going to cost, for this year, they're going to cost 125 billion. and the National Health Service is going to cost 180 billion. So together that's 300 billion, which is a good proportion, over a third, I think, of government spending. So those two categories, state pension and National Health Service, while both very worthwhile and needed, they're very much directed to older generations.
And we've seen that gap widen over the last 20 years or so that the gap has almost doubled in the amount of money that is spent on older people compared to children and young people in the UK.
Now we have some context, let's take a look at the wealth tax they are proposing. Could a wealth tax solve this problem?
Yeah, lots of people have been talking about wealth taxes, partly as a result because wealth inequality has been growing so fast. And we used to have some wealth taxes in the past. They worked well in some ways, not in others. And we should learn from the mistakes of the past when designing a new report. However, unlike other reports which discuss a wealth tax or other proponents of wealth tax, they mainly focus on the issue of inequality more generally in society when discussing a wealth tax. What we wanted to do with this report is to bring in the intergenerational perspective in addition to the perspective of inequality and class, which is quite obvious, and many people talk about that rightly because it needs to be talked about. However, there are other sides than purely the wealth inequality and class inequality, which are important when discussing a wealth tax and the tax system more generally. And what we wanted to therefore bring in is why a wealth tax would benefit young people and why a wealth tax would be a good way to ameliorate the position that young people find themselves in this unfair economy, while at the same time designing a tax system that is sustainable and works for the future.
How much would people have to pay?
So on wealth between 2 and 5 million pounds, you pay 0.8%. On wealth between 5 and 10 million pounds, you pay 1%. And then on any wealth above 10 million, you pay 1.2%. So it's very moderate rates.
You only have to pay this tax if your individual wealth is more than £2 million. In the UK, that's only 1% of people. If their wealth is between 2 and 5 million, they only pay tax on the wealth they have over the £2 million, and they pay tax at a rate of 0.8%. So imagine you have an individual wealth of £2.1 million. That's a nice house you own outright, a fancy car, a big pot of savings, a wardrobe of designer clothes. You pay 0.8% tax annually on the £100,000 you have over the £2 million threshold. That's just £800 a year. Though that might be how I imagine £2 million worth of wealth feeling, I'm sure there are many people with that much wealth tucked away in less ostentatious ways. I wonder if there are people who are liable for this tax who don't even see themselves as wealthy.
There might be, because many people who are quite wealthy don't consider themselves as such. Many people don't consider housing wealth or pension wealth to be wealth in the traditional sense. Some people think about the money in their bank account, but that's not actually how wealth functions. Wealth functions in the economy in terms of your ability to purchase things or to access things. And if you have a big pension pot or own a big house, then that's wealth. So this wealth tax would only affect 1% of society, approximately. And to be in that 1% therefore means that you have at least £2 million of individual wealth, not on a household basis, individual basis. And that is a lot of money. The average person in the 1% has £5 million of wealth. £2 million is the threshold for the wealth tax that we propose. And it's important to remember that median individual wealth in the UK stands at around £125,000. So for the average person to be liable to pay the wealth tax, their wealth would have to increase by 16 times before they would be liable to pay.
Yeah, but we have to bring that back to young people, Alec. And the point is, to a young person, who's incapable of accruing any wealth, the fact that an older person is saying, oh, well, £2 million of wealth isn't a lot, is quite frankly offensive.
Particularly when many young people actually have negative wealth, as in you have more debts than you have assets.
We've looked at wealth by age, and we found that 3 million over 65s were living in households that were millionaire households that had assets of over £1 million. That's 1 in 4 pensioners. That wealth that younger generations isn't going to be able to accrue should be fed back into the economy in terms of government spending.
So how much revenue would this tax generate and where would it be spent?
The conclusion and the policy recommendations that in the name of intergenerational fairness and to improve the health of the economy as a whole, we should institute a wealth tax, a very moderate one, with progressive rates that would raise between 18 and 23 billion pounds a year.
Sorry to interrupt, but just put that in context. So our annual housing benefit bill is around 25 billion, I think.
Yeah, or you could say that, or between 10 to 15% of total spending on the NHS, as another way to compare.
And that seems particularly fair to me from an intergenerational fairness perspective, because with an ageing population, we know that when you're ageing, you're likely to live longer, but live longer with 2 or more chronic illnesses, which is going to involve more spending from the NHS and social care services. So it seems only right that that wealth that's accrued amongst older generations is recycled back into the welfare system.
But we're not necessarily arguing for a higher tax environment. We're saying a fairer tax environment would include a wealth tax. So you could use the money raised either to increase services that are offered, to provided to the population, or you could use it to reduce income tax or national insurance for younger people.
With this wealth tax, you could increase the amount of money that you can earn tax-free every year, your personal allowance. You could increase that by around £1,300. So that would be £1,300 more that you can earn every year that you don't have to pay tax on. And at the same time, you could also reduce national insurance by 1 percentage point. This is one example of something that you could do with the money raised from the wealth tax, and it will still have a couple billion left over.
So that would enable a young worker to be £100 every month better off.
Slightly more even.
Yes.
A wealth tax can be a way to even out the burden of paying for public services, which at the moment is falling disproportionately on taxing income. But there is another side to this too, and it has the potential to change how our economy works.
The housing crisis is a good example to understand the cycle of wealth inequality between the young and the old, because as house prices rise, those who own property get more wealthy, but those who do not, particularly the young, therefore, will have to pay higher private rents. And when you pay higher private rents to your landlord, they get a big chunk of your income. And what wealthy people do with their income is buy more assets. In this country, particularly property is a very attractive asset for the wealthy. So then the wealthy, with their income from rent that they collect, will buy more property. And they will be able to outcompete young renters in the market because they have access to more cash, to more wealth. And as the wealthy landlords buy more property, the prices of housing goes up. And young renters will therefore have to pay more in rent. And so the cycle continues. There's the old saying that wealth begets wealth. And we understand that it's easy to make more money when you have a lot of money. But such an economy also begins to change and begins to take shape when, as wealth inequality increases, that obviously means that you have most of the wealth at the top, and therefore also most of the spending power in the economy exists at the top, and less for the rest of the population. And this has therefore a large impact on the economic structure of what we produce, what we do, etc. That economy, characterized by increasing levels of wealth inequality, will only continue to worsen unless something is done. Because when wealthy people receive more income and grow their wealth, they primarily use that to buy up scarce assets such as property, etc. While people who receive their income from work, young people, average people, they primarily spend it. And that actually drives the real economy forward. But when young people or the average person doesn't have that much money to spend, it becomes increasingly difficult to begin new businesses or invest in productive ventures, because there's fewer and fewer people who are going to be able to spend in those businesses. Therefore, when wealthy people receive more income, they're less and less likely to invest that in real businesses, in productive, innovative ventures, and more likely to invest it in rent-seeking opportunities. There's always a flip side to scarce resources. There's not unlimited land available to build housing on, and that's part of the reason why it's so valuable. But we have to remember, as Angus said, that when the value of those properties and that land rises, and if that rises faster than incomes, that means that those who do not own land or property or other assets are going to have a harder and harder time to access those assets because they are scarce. And therefore, what we call rent-seeking behavior or economic rent in economic jargon is precisely the fact that you invest in assets through which you can collect rent without anything, so to speak, real being produced. So not investing in a factory that produces some goods that are consumed in the economy, but instead, for example, investing in a property or a land or an already existing patent or something where there is no actual economic productivity happening anymore, but you still collect an income. And that's what we mean by rent-seeking behavior. And the reason for why you can understand why this cycle continues to worsen, because of course when wealthy people invest their money into these scarce assets, such as housing, to collect rent, that means that the prices of those assets continue to rise, and therefore that it will be more and more expensive for everyone who doesn't own assets. For example, housing, everyone still needs a place to live, but a larger and larger proportion of the income from work will be sucked up in rent to these unproductive investments instead of investing in productive parts of the economy to try to improve everyone's standard of living.
So taxing wealth could even transform our economy, making it easier for people to access things like housing and encouraging more productive businesses. A wealth tax could raise the money needed to spend on health and social care as our population ages, while also rebalancing the tax burden on younger people by increasing the amount that they can earn tax-free. We'd love to hear your thoughts on our intergenerational fairness case for a wealth tax. Do email us info@if.org.uk. You can DM us on X @inter_gen, or you can message us on Instagram @intergenerational foundation. Thank you for listening.